A twisted American secret. Inside the pages of a family Bible, which had been collecting dust in a rural Kentucky estate sale, the photograph was discovered in 2019. At first glance, the formal family portrait from the 1940s appeared quite innocent. But when genealogologist Sarah Mitchell started tracing the family tree for what she anticipated to be routine ancestry research, she uncovered something. Holding the faded photograph, her hands began to shake at the revelation. The man standing proudly in the center wasn't simply the father of the 3 young boys smiling next to him, he was also their great-grandfather. And the woman seated beside him, holding the youngest child. She wasn't just his wife, she was his grandmother. What Sarah had stumbled upon was a bloodline so fundamentally wrong, so twisted, that it challenged everything we believe about morality, family, and the dark secrets hidden in America's forgotten corners. This is the story of a man who violated every natural law. He created a family tree that loops back on itself in ways that defy comprehension, and his descendants still walk among us today, carrying DNA that tells a story that was never supposed to be told. Hello everyone. Before we begin, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're from and the time you're watching. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories just like this one. Tonight, we're diving into a case that will make you question what you think you know regarding the darkest elements of American family history. This isn't just about the crimes of one man. It's about a bloodline that shouldn't exist, about children who grew up completely unaware of their true parentage, and a secret buried so deeply it took 7 decades for the truth to finally surface. The man at the heart of this story did more than just break laws, he shattered the very fabric of humanity. His name was Thomas Edwin Hartwell. To anyone who met him in the small town of Millfield, Kentucky, he was the picture of respectability. Born in 1901, Thomas was a tall man with a commanding presence and piercing blue eyes that ensured people listened when he spoke. Known for his charitable donations to the town's annual Harvest Festival, he owned the local hardware store and even served as a deacon at the Baptist church. However, behind that carefully constructed facade lurked a predator whose appetite for control was boundless. Thomas's twisted narrative begins not with his horrific crimes, but with his childhood. After his parents died in a tuberculosis outbreak when he was just 8 years old, Thomas was raised by his grandmother, Ella Hartwell, in an isolated farmhouse on the outskirts of town. By the time young Thomas came to live with her, Ella was 62 years old, had already buried 2 husbands and 3 children, and was desperate for companionship in ways that would ultimately prove catastrophic for the boy in her care. While much of what happened in that farmhouse during Thomas's formative years remains shrouded in mystery, court documents later discovered paint a horrifying picture. By the time Thomas turned 16, Ella was no longer merely his guardian. She had become something far more sinister. The relationship that developed between them violated every moral code, every natural boundary, and every law designed to protect the innocent. But Thomas's innocence didn't last long. Under Ella twisted influence, he learned that power meant taking what he wanted, whenever he desired it, regardless of the consequences. By 1919, when Ella was 73 and Thomas was 18, something unthinkable occurred. Ella became pregnant. In an era without modern medical intervention, a 73-year-old woman carrying a child was not only unusual, it was considered nearly impossible. Yet, the county doctor's medical records confirmed the seemingly impossible. In the winter of 1920, Ella Hartwell gave birth to a son. That child would be the first of Thomas's sons, born to his own grandmother, carrying genetic material that would create a bloodline unlike any other documented in American history. Named Samuel, the child was born carrying a genetic nightmare within his DNA that would echo through generations from the moment he drew breath. Samuel was simultaneously Thomas's son and great-nephew, as well as Ella great-grandson and grandson. The mathematical impossibility of his family tree was rivaled only by the physical toll that such genetic compression would inflict on his small body. Samuel was born with what doctors at the time termed developmental irregularities, a clinical euphemism for the horrific results of such extreme inbreeding. His left arm was shorter than his right, his spine curved causing him constant pain, and his mental development was severely stunted. But Thomas saw none of these problems as a reason to stop. If anything, Samuel's condition seemed to fuel a darker element in Thomas, a perverse pride in having created something that shouldn't exist. Just 2 years later, Elalonina gave birth once more. This second child, named Isaac, was even more severely affected. Medical records describe a boy who only learned to walk properly when he was nearly 7 years old, whose speech barely resembled human language, and whose seizures were so violent that Thomas was forced to tie him to his bed at night to prevent self-injury. Even as Isaac struggled with the most basic human functions, Thomas continued to view his children as trophies of his power over the natural order. The third and final child arrived in 1924, when Elalonina was 77, an age at which pregnancy should have been biologically impossible. This boy, named Ezra, was born with the most severe deformities yet. His internal organs were incorrectly positioned, his skull was misshapen, and his life expectancy was measured in months, not years. Yet, somehow, Ezra survived against all medical odds. He lived, but in a state that could barely be considered living. What makes this story even more disturbing is how Thomas managed to conceal these births from the community. In the 1920s in rural Kentucky, record-keeping was, at best, spotty, and Thomas had significant connections throughout the county government. The official birth certificates list Elalonina as the mother and father unknown, a lie Thomas orchestrated to protect his reputation while continuing his monstrous behavior. These 3 boys grew up believing Thomas was their uncle and Elalonina was their mother, never learning the true horror of their parentage until decades later, when genetic testing finally revealed the impossible truth. To live with the knowledge of what he had done required Thomas to become a master of lies and manipulation. The small Millfield community never questioned why a respected businessman like Thomas would choose to live with his elderly grandmother and her 3 strange children. Multi-generational households were common in the 1920s and 1930s, particularly during the Great Depression, and Thomas utilized this social acceptance as perfect camouflage for his crimes. But maintaining the lie demanded constant vigilance. Thomas homeschooled all 3 boys, claiming that their various conditions made regular school attendance impossible. This was not entirely false. Isaac's severe developmental delays and Samuel's physical deformities would have indeed made integration into a normal classroom challenging. However, Thomas kept them isolated not for their protection, but for his own. He couldn't risk the boys forming relationships with outsiders who might ask too many questions about the family's structure. The boys grew up in a world where normal human relationships were incomprehensible because they had never witnessed them. They called Thomas Uncle Tommy, and Elalonina Mama, never suspecting that their uncle visited their mother's bedroom every night. They didn't know that other families didn't lock their children in the basement when visitors called. They had no frame of reference for understanding that the way Thomas spoke to them, the way he touched them, and the way he controlled every aspect of their existence wasn't how families were supposed to function. Meanwhile, Elalonina was deteriorating rapidly under the strain of enduring Thomas's continued abuse while caring for 3 severely disabled children. By 1925, she was exhibiting signs of what we would now recognize as severe mental illness, talking to people who weren't there, occasionally forgetting to feed the children for days, and becoming increasingly paranoid that the townspeople were watching her. Thomas exploited her declining mental state to further isolate the family, telling concerned neighbors that Elalonina was becoming senile and needed protection from overstimulation. The most chilling element of this period is the way Thomas began grooming his own sons for what was to come. As Samuel approached adolescence, Thomas started having private talks with him about keeping secrets, about family loyalty, and about the special, unique bond they shared that outsiders simply wouldn't understand. These were not conversations between an uncle and a nephew, they were the calculated manipulations of a predator preparing his next victims. And as Elalonina aged and weakened, Thomas was already planning for a future where his control over the bloodline would continue through the next generation. Elalonina died in the winter of 1931, discovered frozen in her bed on a February morning when the temperature had dropped below 0. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. But those who saw her body before the burial whispered about the bruises on her throat, the terror frozen in her dead eyes, and the way her hands were clenched into fists. Thomas organized a small funeral, claiming Evelynina had always wanted a simple burial. In reality, he could not risk a larger gathering where people might ask uncomfortable questions about the strange family dynamics. With Evelynina gone, Thomas's control over his sons became absolute. Samuel, then 11 years old, Isaac, 9, and Ezra, 7, were completely dependent on the man they still believed was their uncle. But Thomas's plans for them extended far beyond simple guardianship. Within months of Evelynina's death, he began implementing a twisted education program that would prepare his sons for roles they could not yet comprehend. If you're still watching, you are already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this were your bloodline. Thomas started by separating the boys, moving them into different rooms for the first time in their lives. He explained to them it was because they were becoming young men who needed privacy. But the real reason was far more sinister. He needed to begin working on them individually, breaking down their ability to support each other and making each boy dependent solely on him for basic survival, approval, and affection. Despite his physical limitations, Samuel was the most mentally capable of the three. Thomas began teaching him about carrying on the bloodline and family responsibilities. These lessons started innocently enough, with discussions about how their family was special and how they had to protect each other from outsiders who wouldn't understand their bond. But as Samuel entered puberty, the conversations became more explicit. Thomas started describing what would be expected of Samuel when he came of age, how he would need to ensure the family continued, and how certain sacrifices would be required for the greater good of their bloodline. The most disturbing evidence of this grooming comes from a diary Samuel kept during this period, which was discovered decades later, hidden in the walls of the old farmhouse. In childish handwriting, Samuel wrote about the special talks with Uncle Tommy, about learning to be a real man, and about the day when he would have responsibilities like Uncle Tommy had with Mama. Reading these entries today, the progression of Thomas's manipulation is painfully clear, a systematic psychological breakdown designed to prepare Samuel for crimes that would make Thomas's own seem almost merciful by comparison. By 1936, Samuel had reached the age of 16, the same age Thomas had been when his relationship with Evelynina began. The parallels were not coincidental. Thomas had spent 5 years meticulously orchestrating this moment, preparing Samuel for a role that would perpetuate the genetic nightmare he had created. But Thomas's plan had one crucial difference from his own experience. He intended to maintain control over the next generation while ensuring the bloodline continued through his sons. The first indication that Thomas's plan was succeeding came in the form of hushed conversations between Samuel and his younger brothers. Neighbors later reported hearing strange sounds emanating from the farmhouse at night, shouting, crying, and what one witness described as sounds no human should make. But in rural Kentucky during the Depression, people tended to mind their own business, especially concerning the eccentric Hartwell family. By 1937, the impossible happened once more. Samuel, at 17, had fathered a child. But the mother was not a girl from town, it was someone much closer to home. Court documents that were sealed for decades and only recently uncovered revealed that Samuel had impregnated Ruth, Isaac's twin sister. Ruth's existence had been completely hidden from public records from the moment she was born alongside Isaac. Ruth, who was simultaneously Samuel's aunt, sister, and great-niece, gave birth to a child whose genetic profile was so catastrophically inbred that modern DNA analysis struggles to map the family connections. This child, a girl named Mary, represented the third generation of genetic horror, raised in secrecy in the same basement where Thomas had once hidden Evelynina's pregnancies. Mary was born with deformities so severe that constant medical care was necessary for her survival. Yet Thomas viewed her birth not as a tragedy, but as proof that his blood bond was special, chosen, and different from ordinary families who abided by society's rules. The pattern Thomas had established was now repeating with mathematical precision. Samuel began exhibiting the same controlling behaviors Thomas had shown, the same manipulation tactics, and the same complete disregard for the well-being of his victims. But unlike Thomas, who at least possessed the intelligence to maintain a public facade, Samuel was too damaged by his upbringing to function in normal society. His crimes became more violent, more erratic, and infinitely more difficult to hide from the outside world. By 1939, even the isolated community of Millfield could no longer ignore what was happening in the Hartwell farmhouse. The sound of screaming had become too frequent, the smell coming from the property too strong, and the sight of Samuel wandering through town covered in blood was too disturbing to overlook. The end came on a cold November morning in 1939, when Sheriff William Mackenzie received a call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A traveling salesman, having stopped at the Hartwell farmhouse for directions, had glimpsed something through a broken window that sent him driving straight to the police station, shaking and unable to speak coherently for nearly an hour. What Mackenzie discovered upon arriving at the farmhouse defied every horror he had witnessed in 20 years of law enforcement. In the basement, he found the bodies of Isaac and Ezra, who the coroner later estimated had been dead for several weeks. But more disturbing than the deaths was the evidence of what had been occurring in that house for nearly 2 decades. Hidden rooms contained restraints used to hold people against their will, medical equipment clearly used for childbirth, and documentation of genetic experiments that read like the work of a madman. Thomas was found in the main bedroom, having apparently taken his own life rather than face the consequences of his crimes. Beside him lay a letter, written in his careful handwriting, which contained what he referred to as his confession and manifesto. In it, he described his actions not as crimes, but as a noble experiment in creating a pure bloodline free from outside contamination. He wrote about his conviction that his family was chosen for something greater than ordinary human morality, and that the children born from his relationships were proof of his genetic superiority. Samuel was discovered in the barn, catatonic and covered in blood that was not his own. He was taken into custody, but he never stood trial. His mental state had deteriorated to the point where he couldn't comprehend the charges against him. He spent the remaining 43 years of his life in a state mental institution, never speaking another coherent word. The surviving children, those who had lived through the horror of the Hartwell bloodline, were quietly placed in institutions across 3 different states. Their identities were changed, their medical records were sealed, and every effort was made to ensure that the genetic nightmare Thomas had created would die with them. But DNA doesn't lie. Modern genetic testing has revealed that at least 6 descendants of the Hartwell bloodline are alive today, scattered across the country, most completely unaware of the true horror of their ancestry. By order of the county judge, the farmhouse was burned to the ground and declared a public health hazard. The official records of the case were sealed for 50 years. When they were finally opened in 1989, most people assumed the story was simply too outrageous to be true. However, genetic science has confirmed what those sealed documents revealed. Thomas Edwin Hartwell created a bloodline so genetically compromised that it challenges our understanding of the limits of human survival. Today, genetic counselors and genealogists still encounter the Hartwell DNA signature in their research. When they do, they face an impossible ethical decision: do they tell their clients the truth about their ancestry? Or do they protect them from knowledge that could destroy their sense of self? Most choose silence, believing that some secrets are too dark to ever see the light of day. But the truth remains, preserved in genetic markers and buried in sealed court records that tell a story no one wanted to preserve. Thomas Edwin Hartwell didn't merely commit crimes against his family, he created a genetic legacy that will echo through generations, a bloodline that carries within it the DNA evidence of humanity's capacity for unthinkable evil. And somewhere out there, his descendants walk among us, carrying genes that tell a story they may never fully understand.